Heidegger and current events. One, I give a personal testimony on an experience on X, which I justify by saying it's an example of the experiences today that are in power. I think it's called Philosophy on X. I had a very brief flamenco dance with them. Totally, I think, remained in keeping with the Rudyard Kipling type of if situation. I wasn't moved at all by it, but it's like 5 posts or something, and then he blocked me for apparently, so far as I can tell, just for knowing more about philosophy than he does. But that wasn't difficult because I was just thinking of this Kurzon quote about the, how does he put it, steadiness of intellect and force of character. And I thought the steadiness of intellect is kind of like the British way of saying stoicism is sort of the British way of talking about stoicism, and that the poetic expression of that is Kipling's if. So if while you're being blamed and so on, you can remain clear and maintain a sublimity and vigor of mind, then you're okay. So I guess I'm okay, I think. But I think it's worth pointing out that, what the situation is. So this guy has relatively a large following, like 380,000 followers. And when I put in because it seems sort of silly, I understand that, but because it's connected to the existentialism in that a living person has to be the one to become a philosopher. So Socrates, for example, Socrates is probably the most emblematic example. If Plato is maybe more considered more divine in a certain sense. I made a post that said Peter Falk is like a miniature Socrates, on the notion that we're trying to pin down the personality of Socrates, and that Derrida could offer also a visualization or inductive glance at what Socrates might have been like. There's other accounts that make Socrates. I know we could also try sort of that the Orson Welles type figure would be more appropriate. I understand that approach. There's also some short dramatic films that I've seen of a film version of one of the dialogues with the excellent stage actor that does more in the Orson Welles direction. I could see that too, but this just attempts. But in any case, well, the thing that I wanted to say is this guy that runs the site wrote back. He said Socrates isn't goofy because he considered Peter Falk, because I had a screenshot of Peter Falk smiling in a way that made him look mildly goofy, although I thought it was charming. And then he said Socrates was ugly and single. So he's correct. I understand Socrates is ugly, but is Peter Falk really particularly good looking? I know that he is, at least when he was younger, he was handsome to some extent, but is not really known for that. I would agree. I would concede that this manager of the Philosophy on X site is correct, that Peter Falk is not particularly known for being ugly, and Derrida even the reverse. So in that sense, I concede that point. But then he went on to say Socrates was single. So I think anybody that has even the slightest familiarity with Plato knows there's this Xanthippe theme in the background of a number of his dialogues. I think maybe 2 explicitly, and she even appears. I think she's almost the only woman that appears in any Platonic dialogues, is that she shows up for a brief moment in at the time of Socrates' death, and he says, get rid of her, get her out of here, and that's it. But it's also known that he had 3 children, and that Xanthippe is mentioned in other respects, with insofar as Socrates, not just in Plato but also in Xenophon, because there's this notion that he had married her because he wanted to marry a shrew in order to test his character, if he can withstand this personality. And so it's a philosophic gamble. And then it's also said that he had another wife. So, I mean, not knowing something that basic, it's, I mean, I don't think that discredits anyone from their ability to think, but it does say something about, here's this guy running a extremely popular 388,000, well, okay, it's not extreme, I mean, it's not millions, but still a rather popular X channel, and in a way being a gatekeeper to who has more airplay in philosophy, and he doesn't know the most simple thing. Okay, that I don't consider that particularly discrediting on the face of it, but then in connection with the following, that he seems to right before, so I guess the occasion for him blocking me was he asked something about Willard Quine. It was like I've studied like 20 years ago, but I haven't thought about it much for a while, and I gave my opinion, which is sort of, I think, he remained all his life a kind of naive positivist, for the reason that positivism was a big deal when he was young, and then he was a personal student of Carnap, and basically, I think Heidegger is just better. It's simply Heidegger's thought through all that more thoroughly, more seriously, and he's more intelligent. Heidegger is simply better. It's objective. You could raise, it's a long story, is Heidegger's moral character up to that of Socrates. That's a long story, but I think Heidegger in his own way was pushing towards Socrates' version of Dike, which is how to make the people better, how to make the Sittlichkeit better, in Hegelian terms, how to make the objective morality better. The Straussian example there would be, all cannibals think, or as it were, take for granted that cannibalism is normal. So that's part of the objective morality, the Sittlichkeit. How to improve the Sittlichkeit, maybe on other planets, is better, Kant is amused. I think in his own way Heidegger tried to do that with his, but let's not go into that. It doesn't really matter that much at the moment. But anyway, that was the occasion for the being blocked. But I had only posted like 5-6 things or something, and had just a few interactions on it. So maybe he was just sort of, that's what makes it ambiguous. Maybe it's just sort of saying, what's the character of this person I want them, are they going to help me promote my channel and grow my channel? I don't know what his considerations were at all, because he didn't say anything. But I guess starting from that, I find it a nice provocation just to say, what are the problems where analytic philosophy, we could say, definitely is naive by comparison to Heidegger, and discourse Heidegger is taking part in. And I think one, there's a basic claim from those camps, from the not just from A.J. Ayer, Russell, and who's the other guy, the good guy, Moore, the guy that did the theologian. That guy's pretty good, I think. But again, they haven't looked at all the I mean, that guy just sort of keeps with the Catholics. With the Catholics, then we could see Heidegger's criticism of that type of view. E.G. Moore, I think, the guy that did that, he did a nice discussion where he tried to convince Russell of the Catholic position. I could possibly be mistaken. Maybe he was arguing for the Anglican tradition, but it's sort of theologically, I think it's not that different, so far as I understand it. But maybe he was arguing for the Catholic. I'll have to look that up. But those aren't the main guys I'm thinking of. I'm thinking more of Mach and, M-A-C-H. Somebody corrected me on that not long ago. I say Mach, so it makes me think of the T, and in the transliteration, I'd still be right, is what I argued there. But it sounds like that in German to me, anyway. But I think Carnap also is a big source from the Germans, a big German source for them. And what Carnap tries to do is just, Heidegger has thoroughly looked at the basis of those type of arguments. So it's like you try to say we're beyond the nominalism, realism problem, but then what you do is you step back into a position where you have to rely on your sort of, as Strauss put it, quoting Churchill, low but solid common sense. But the problem is philosophy doesn't happen in common sense, which is to say it's always an attempt to think about things that common sense has overlooked and try to improve our views on them. For instance, that A.J. Ayer says common sense is not scientific, it's subjective, it believes in tears. Science has to talk about the chemical components of that substance, not about the tears. It can't remain with the qualia. And this whole discussion, it goes beyond common sense. That's what I would claim. Like science presents itself as going beyond common sense. Whether improving it or not is a big question. But the whole point of existentialism from this angle is that, one, nobody is ever completely a scientist, for instance, or let's say Carnap, but nobody is, or let's say Quine, nobody is ever totally a mathematical logician. So, I mean, what happened is sort of medieval scholastic logic went away, was no longer considered particularly relevant, became a sort of a drone thing, by rote thing, simple syllogistic logic, but also those long lists of quasi-fallacies, informal fallacies, more informal fallacies, I think, was a big problem with the reception of medieval logic by people like the Brights, the Bright Society, which originally presented itself like a political movement. They just misused all those things in a gross way and applied them in a sort of cookie cutter fashion that didn't work. But that's just an example that shows the decay of that type of logic and how it doesn't work for daily life anymore. So they tried to say, oh no, we're going up to scientific logic, properly scientific logic. And this properly scientific logic, according to Carnap, is no longer mixed up in the realism, nominalism debate, but it's neither. And we shouldn't try to pretend we're just empirical or something, but we should instead, he had a kind of set theory method of saying either we're inside the problem, the mathematical problem, or we're outside of it. When we're inside it, there's a consistent. When we're outside of it, something else. But that begins the problem, because you're not actually living. People get mad, they call themselves, oh, I'm a mathematician, I'm a historian or something, but they don't actually, it's in a way there's a cosplay element, right? They're not actually, nobody grows up with their native languages as math. They're not mathematicians in the way cannibals are cannibals. They're always themselves, and therefore they have to the evasion of all these questions of, well, what's the place of this teaching within my life? And how much weight does it carry? And what are the real conditions of my Dasein? That's where the phenomenology and Heidegger and existentialism, so-called, have to come in. I don't mean, John Paul Sartre isn't so bad, I don't think. It's just Heidegger said what's this Dreck, when Sartre was trying to talk about these very questions we're trying to touch on with Quine and Carnap, and the more basic stratum of questions. But he's not that bad on some things. But anyway, that's sort of irrelevant. But let me end this just by trying to give more sort of meat to what Carnot was trying to do. It's basically, why is Carnot metaphysics? So they're claiming we're no longer doing metaphysics, but then really they are. So they're doing a different kind of metaphysics. And one way to look at that is more explicit in Bergson, who says language basically exists for describing spatial things. But what they assume, like Quine and Carnot assume, is basically that language crops up around sense data. And so that what they're talking about is something like a theory of sense data plus sets which act as machines, and the machines are like, you're trying to do something, build a bomb or something, and then you need equations which are machines that work in a certain way to do that. And then they have some other metaphysical assertions, like that there are no why, that you can't say, there's no reasonable sense in talking about why, but they don't give a long discussion about why and how they go from daily life, how we can, it's always, there's this tacit sort of Richard Dawkins cheat where it's like, oh yeah, this is our scientific opinion, but in daily life we're not going to act like that. We're just going to go on in the so-called, they used some time ago, they used to call it the folk understanding rather than the scientific understanding. Oh, we know this is the gene, the so-called selfish gene, this stupid notion of Dawkins, which makes a metaphor that doesn't even make sense. And then he goes on to say, oh, but we have to rebel against the selfish gene. That's what he says in the selfish gene, actually, in the text, is that we have to, quote, rebel, unquote, against the selfish gene. So that all these problems, I mean, that's a way more crude than anything you find in Quine, but nonetheless, it points in these directions that there's all these untied problems that you really have to thoroughly look at, and it's not a joke. It's affecting. It's basically the question of how are we going to make decisions. We're not trees, so the trees don't have to make decisions, but we make decisions. We don't want to do them in this phony way of, I have this mathematical logic that is the true science, but it's just a machine, and I don't really think about that way, and then I have no philosophy about the way my Dasein actually is.